Another summary then, looking at the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam and the changing tactics that the Americans use against the North Vietnamese and the VC, that is the communists operating in South Vietnam. So we start with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. Now, whether or not the Americans were in international waters or not in international waters inside North Vietnamese waters, they nonetheless have been involved in deploying South Vietnamese special forces into North Vietnam. So when those ships were attacked, allegedly attacked, the administration of President Johnson, looking to get re-elected in 1964, goes to Congress and asks for approval to escalate the war. And that is escalate it way beyond what had been undertaken by Kennedy and Eisenhower and Truman before him. So Johnson gets the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed in 1964, and with the support of Congress, who also give him lots and lots of money, and with the overwhelming support of the American people, he initiates Operation Rolling Thunder. Now that's going to involve the bombing of the infrastructure in North Vietnam, and also the carpet bombing of North Vietnam once all the infrastructure has been removed. Now remember, the American tactics are based around the idea that you can win wars by dropping bombs. That's what happened in World War II when they were dropping bombs on Germany, and it was what to a large extent was working in North Korea during the Korean War. However, of course, there wasn't much of an infrastructure in North Vietnam to actually attack. So Rolling Thunder just kept literally rolling along. It kept bombing and bombing and bombing, and although it affected North Vietnam's capacity to fight a war, it never stopped it. So Rolling Thunder, once it had hit its specific targets and destroyed them, it then moves on to carpet bombing. But unfortunately, the problem with carpet bombing and cluster bombing subsequently was that it couldn't deal with the problem of the North Vietnamese jungle. It was just too big. So again, there's going to be a tactical change. What you have to do is you have to change your tactics when you acknowledge that your tactics aren't working. So the jungle then becomes a problem. So the next logical escalation is to use chemical weapons. Weapons like Agent Orange were used to defoliate the jungle and therefore reveal the VC and the North Vietnamese as targets to be hit. But unfortunately, despite using these weapons, and despite them working, they were also having massive consequences as well. Initially, once the jungle died, it drove the Viet Cong into the tunnels to hide away and avoid the fact that they no longer had any cover under the jungle. But also, because the VC were operating in South Vietnam, it also led to the dilemma that the Americans were forced to use these defoliants on their own ally, on South Vietnam. And if you remember from the start of the course, the South Vietnamese peasants were already much more likely to have loyalties towards the communists than they were to have towards the government in South Vietnam, which was corrupt and also siphoning money in a corrupt way away from the poor in South Vietnam. So the chemical weapons didn't endear the Americans to the South Vietnamese. It killed their crops, and of course many of these South Vietnamese peasants then left the countryside and moved to the cities, which we'll come back to later when we deal with the Tet Offensive in 1968. Also, the long-term effects of exposure to these chemicals were also remarkably dangerous. It was carcinogenic, it caused cancer, and it caused birth defects, and of course it polluted the ecosystem. So these chemical weapons had huge consequences. Rolling Thunder, cluster bombing, carpet bombing, the use of chemical weapons, none of these escalations in turn solved the problem of the Vietnam War. With all of this manpower and firepower that the Americans were deploying, it's very clear that the Americans weren't going to lose this war. But equally, it was very clear that they weren't winning the war. So tactics change again. In 1965, Johnson starts to deploy ground troops in serious numbers. Initially, the ground troops went in when Rolling Thunder started because what was required was the need to protect the bases. When the air bases were attacked by the VC and the North Vietnamese, then obviously more and more ground troops are being deployed. By 1965, the American armed forces are involved in serious combat on the ground, And because of their technological advantages, they are obviously killing an awful lot of VC, a disproportionate amount. Because they're so well trained, because they've got such overwhelming firepower and superior technology, the VC follow and prosecute a guerrilla war. They will not take the Americans on one-on-one. It simply wouldn't do. On the contrary, they run away. Therefore, when the Americans go after them, they can't go fighting the kind of war they want to fight. They have to pursue search and destroy tactics. Intelligence directs them to a specific target. They arrive at the target, they search. If they find the VC, they destroy them. However, of course, because the VC are using guerrilla tactics that you are researching, it becomes psychologically very difficult for the American forces to behave in a way that you would expect them to. And the search and destroy missions very rapidly become destroy and search missions, or Zippo missions, where simply they fly in, set fire to the village, and leave. Now, 1967, the war takes a different turn. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, his military commander, are aware of the fact that the VC and the North Korean Vietnamese are not winning the war. At the same time, the Americans very clearly are able to keep fighting the war and certainly not lose it, but neither side are clearly going to win. The North Vietnamese decide to change tactics. Giap's strategy is to attack the Americans out in the open, exactly what the Americans have wanted from day one. And they do this at a place called Khe Sanh. They lay siege to the American base at Khe Sanh, and they force the Americans to fight. President Johnson, knowing that he believes that this is the battle that he must win, because of course 1967, 68, 69 are moving up to an election year, pours massive amounts of material and men into Khe Sanh. Now, as that fight goes on, President Johnson interprets the VC's change of tactics as an admission of their weakness. And of course, he talks to the American people, saying therefore that it's very clear that American strategy, American tactics are working. When in fact the reality is that Khe Sanh was merely a distraction. But as the battle is being waged for Khe Sanh, the North Vietnamese are moving their weapons, supplies and materials down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam and smuggling these materials via tunnels into the major urban centres of South Vietnam. These are places that the Americans are convinced are safely held by them. These are places the American people believe that the war is not being fought because the people there are safely under the control of the South Vietnamese and the Americans. And during the Tet Offensive, whilst Khe Sanh is dominating the news, the Tet Offensive is being planned. Then during the Tet Offensive proper, the VC break loose in all these major cities, 100 of them in South Vietnam, and they take the war to places that the Americans had never anticipated. All of a sudden, Johnson's confidence and bragging that the war was being won, that the American tactics were in fact eventually prevailing, is proved to be completely wrong, because, as one of the American generals said, the entire South Vietnam lit up like a pinball machine, with the VC attacking absolutely anywhere and everywhere. The media reporting from places such as Saigon were reporting live using satellite technology and showing that America was seemingly losing control. Now, the Tet Offensive was a gamble. The belief was that all of these people fleeing because of the use of chemical weapons and cluster bombing and Operation Rolling Thunder, moving into the cities, would be sympathetic towards the North Vietnamese and the VC. And Giap was prepared to risk 10,000 of his best men in order to start a revolution in these cities that would be followed by a popular uprising amongst the South Vietnamese. That was not the case. On the contrary, he lost those 10,000 men. And the way in which the Americans did it was calmly and efficiently and professionally carry out this operation. Unfortunately, it was done in front of the eyes of the world media. And to your average American back home, in the living rooms of America, It did not look like a calm, controlled, military, professional operation. It looked disorganized, it looked chaotic, and there were American soldiers being wounded and killed, and civilians being wounded and injured. And it was a turning point in the war. Remember, the Vietnam War was not lost in the paddy fields of Vietnam. It was lost in the living rooms of America. The Americans couldn't control their media, nor understood why they should. This was the first modern media war. And subsequently, the images being broadcast undermined the will of the American public to keep the war going. Now, is it a coincidence that the VC used these tactics in the run-up to an election? Probably not. It's probably very much a planned idea. Did they exploit the media? It was probably a planned idea. Did they plan on the South Vietnamese supporting the uprising? Yes, they did, and there their tactics failed. But they tipped the balance away from America's support for the war to America withdrawing her support for the war.